Welcome to the Orlando Sentinel Editorial Board interview for State Attorney in the Ninth Judicial Circuit. That's Orange and Osceola counties. This race features duly elected State Attorney Monique Worrell, who was elected in 2020 by an overwhelming margin, only to be suspended by Governor Ron DeSantis, who claimed in his order of suspension that Worrell was neglecting her duty and was incompetent. A Sentinel review of some of those cases revealed that many of his claims were not correct, and Worrell has vigorously disputed other claims. We'll talk a little bit about that later in the interview, but you can find so much more information on that in our archives. And so what we would like to do is kind of focus on the race and what lies ahead. Worrell is facing former Judge Andrew Bain, who was appointed by DeSantis to take over the state attorney's office. He couldn't join us today because of urgent family matters, but there are other debates and discussions between the two available online. There is one more odd wrinkle with this race. The Republican nominee, Seth Hyman, who spent quite a bit of money on the primary, dropped out of the race soon after he defeated his opponent, Thomas Fighter. And Fighter has since endorsed Ms. Worrell. So that leaves her facing Andrew Bain, who is running as a nonpartisan candidate. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with our first question.
There's just one thing. I'm sorry. I don't believe that Fighter has endorsed me, so I just want to make sure that we're clear on that fact. I don't think that he's made an endorsement, although he has called out what he believes is, political interference by the Republican Party.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, and we will make sure we include that information in the editorial. But I would like to start with our first question, though, and I think it's one that you've been talking a lot about. You were elected in 2020 on a very clear platform of criminal justice reform, which included alternative sanctions for people convicted of relatively minor offenses and a look at policies that might reduce crime before it happens. Why do you think this is important?
Yes, well, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. Yes, I was elected on a very clear platform, and it's important to state that. In fact, that cannot be overstated because I was very clear with the voters on what my intentions were. Having 25 years of criminal practice experience and 17 of those years as a law professor at the University of Florida College of Law, I am very clear on historically what our criminal legal system has done. And those things are, one, mass incarceration, meaning that we as the United States incarcerate more people than anywhere in the world. And here in the state of Florida, we do it at a rate higher than the national average. And then disproportionate minority representation in those incarceration numbers. Minority communities are more heavily policed. Their individuals are more often arrested and they are more harshly charged for crimes than their Caucasian counterparts. So those were very important issues, as in addition to lack of accountability for law enforcement for police violence in communities of colors. And those issues were very clear. I campaigned on those issues. The people in this community agreed with me on those issues, and they overwhelmingly elected me in 2020 by more than 66% of the vote to implement policies that were in conjunction with those issues. So there was no surprise to the voters about what I was going to do. And I'm happy to say that in just the 2.5 years that I was in office, we saw the lowest violent crime rate that we've had in a decade, in addition to reduced incarceration. So what that showed is that we can do both. We can reduce crime and we can reduce incarceration and build stronger, safer communities.
One of the biggest challenges that state attorneys face is recruiting and retaining attorneys, investigators, and other staff. Your opponents say a significant number of people resigned in the year after you took office. How do you respond to that, and what would you do to ensure that you have enough prosecutors and staff to do the job if you're elected?
So I'll first start by saying that nearly 60 people have resigned since I was taken out of office. And that turnover rate is not something that I'm going to blame specifically on my opponent, but I'm going to blame on the fact that we ask assistant state attorneys, and we want to, as a community, as a society, pay them very little to do that. One of the things that I did as state attorney was I went to Tallahassee to lobby for increases in salaries. I raised salaries to a record number under my administration so that we could retain our employees. Turnover is something that we have throughout the state and throughout the country in state attorney and public defender's offices, particularly after the mass exodus or the great resignation that we saw take place after COVID. So this wasn't something that was specific to my administration, but as we've seen, many things that are not specific to my administration get blamed as only happening within my administration. So I think it's very important to note that, one, there have been more than 60 people or almost 60 people who have resigned from the state attorney's office since last August when I was removed. And two, in at least one debate, if not both of them, my opponent referenced the fact that he's fully staffed for the first time in 10 years. Well, a public records request showed that of the I believe 170 attorney positions that there are within the state attorney's office. At the time of his statement, only 130 of those positions were filled with attorneys. So what that is further evidence of my opponent's lack of credibility. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And this definitely played a role in the governor's original presentation when he suspended you, but you have more of a story to tell around this. I remember the relationship between the state attorney's office and local law enforcement agencies. What needs to be done to ensure that those relationships, should you be reelected, are on a positive basis and are constructive with meeting your goals?
Yeah, this is a very important question because, again, a false narrative has been painted as though I didn't have any relationships with law enforcement and that it was impossible for us to work together. So I want to go ahead and I want to invite people to go to my Facebook page. And there, I want you to look through the entire 2.5 years that I was in office. And what you'll see is that there were great collaborations between my office and law enforcement. Some of those collaborations included the Violent Crime Task Force, which, again, my opponent has negated existed, but a simple public record search will show emails between my staff and law enforcement. And this was a collaboration between local and federal law enforcement, my office and the United States Attorney's Office, where they met biweekly to discuss the most dangerous and prolific offenders in our community and how we could work collaboratively to rebuild the strongest cases against those individuals and remove them from our community. And that work was done, and it was done for more than a year under my administration. Another collaboration was the Adult Civil Citation Program that was done for the first time in this circuit under my administration, where, again, my office works collaboratively with law enforcement to help prevent first-time and low-level offenders from the harm that comes from arrest. Once individuals are fingerprinted and their mugshots are taken, that interferes with their ability to find adequate housing, some of them for getting student loans to attend higher education, and certainly employment consequences that come from that. So we collaborated to ensure that law enforcement would have an option to give people something that's similar to a ticket. That ticket would then refer them to my office, and we would be able to implement appropriate sanctions, whether it be education, community service, and a fine. So there was accountability for their actions. but they were spared the harshest consequences of the criminal legal system. And these were just some of our collaborations. So it's just not true when people say that our offices didn't work together. We did, but we also ensured that there was accountability when it was necessary. And that's a very important balance between working with law enforcement.
Thank you very much for that. Another criticism leveled against you when you were in office and when you were removed is that your policies resulted in the release of people who went on to commit violent felonies. What strategies would you put in place if you are reelected to ensure that dangerous defendants are not released?
So I want to revert back to my original answer when I talked about the fact that violent crime was at a decade low under my administration. And while many individuals have tried to fact check this and say, well, she can't take credit for that because it's a collaborative effort, I don't disagree with that. The low violent crime rate was in fact a collaborative effort, which is more evidence towards my successful collaborations with law enforcement. But what it meant is that we could not have achieved the lowest violent crime rate in a decade if my policies led to an increase in crime. The two cannot coexist. So it's really important for people to understand that I don't bring up the lowest violent crime rate to say that I achieved it by myself. I bring it up to point to the fact that the statement that I contributed to increase crime is just not credible. Now, let's talk about the case involving Keith Moses, because there's lately been a commercial circulating paid for by the Republican Party saying that I was responsible for the death committed by Keith Moses because I let him go. Now, that's just not true. And it's been debunked locally here repeatedly. Keith Moses had a very lengthy criminal history, which was a juvenile history, one. Two, the majority of which happened before I ever took office. And finally, the only charge that he had under my administration was for possession of 4 grams of marijuana, a charge that wasn't being prosecuted anywhere across the state because the Florida Department of Law Enforcement wasn't testing marijuana under 50 grams. But even had he been prosecuted for that, he would not have received a sentence for 4 grams of marijuana that would have detained him long enough to prevent him from being involved in the Pine Hill shooting. And finally, I want to say to that during that same time period, there were similar shootings that took place in both Marion County and Brevard County with individuals who also had criminal histories and then went out and committed shootings. And none of those state attorneys were blamed for the deaths that happened as a result of those shootings. The only state attorney who was blamed for that was me. And I want people to go out and look at what the difference is between myself and the state attorneys in both Brevard and Marion County, and then ask yourself, why am I the only one being blamed?
Actually, that, focusing on specific cases is always, when you're dealing with thousands of cases, is always going to be a tough call. But I wanted to ask you a bigger picture question. Can you talk to us about the relationship between your prosecutorial policies and daily lives in communities across Osceola and Orange counties? What were you trying to achieve, and what signs did you see that let you know either that you were getting there or that you weren't?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important question, because at the end of the day, it comes down to real people. And, it's important for people to understand, I don't sit on high and look down low and make policies, right? I live in this community with all of you. I'm raising my family in this community with all of you. When the Pine Hill shooting happened, I was deeply impacted because we worship in Pine Hills. My family does. My husband works in Pine Hills. One of my children attends school in Pine Hills. So that was something that I experienced with this community. I didn't stand outside and look in. And what I have to say is that what I saw was that during the 2.5 years that I was in office, my policies were working. We saw a reduction in violent crime. It didn't mean we obliterated it. But that's just not realistic, right? Obliterated violent crime hasn't happened anywhere. But nationally, what we've seen is that we move our policies further towards justice. We see violent crime reduce, and we see our incarceration rates reduce. So what I have to say is that it was working. We made gains, we made progress. And when I'm reelected, we'll continue along that path, and we'll continue to see progress. And there's more work to be done. I don't say that in 2.5 years I completed everything that needs to be done and now I can take office again and put my feet up and not do anything. But what I can say is that the numbers don't lie. People lie, but the numbers don't. And under my administration, the numbers show that we experienced the lowest violent crime rate that we had in a decade. And what that means is not that I individually created that environment, but it means that the work that I and my office were doing was successful, and that we can continue along that path so that we as a community continue to see a reduction in violent crime and other crime as well.
Thank you very much for that answer. We did want to spend some time talking about your suspension. You have said that you believe that Ron DeSantis acted wrongly in suspending you. Can you briefly explain to our readers why that is? I know that's a big picture question, but we're sort of trying to boil it down.
So, yes, I believe he acted wrongly. I believe he had acted unjustly. And although the Florida Supreme Court disagrees, I believe that he acted illegally. And the reason I say that is because while the Florida Constitution provides that elected officials may be suspended, historically, we'll see that this has only been done in extreme circumstances where individuals have been charged with a crime, for instance, or convicted of a crime, where individuals have been shown to have an addiction issue that prevents them from being able to do their jobs adequately and serve the people, where individuals have been shown to have acted unethically and have endangered the welfare of the communities that they serve. But what we've not seen is what has happened in my situation and the situation of State Attorney Andrew Warren in Hillsborough County, where individuals have been suspended simply because the governor disagrees with their ideology. And that is very dangerous. And it's important for people to understand how very dangerous it is. Because what that means is that the will of the voters doesn't matter. And what that means is that we no longer are functioning within the context of a democracy, but rather we're functioning within the context of a dictatorship. And people may think that that's hyperbole and that I'm being very dramatic. But essentially, the reason we have elections at every level is so that if you have a president that you don't like, then you might get a governor that you don't like. And if you have a governor that you don't like, you might be able to elect legislators that you like. And if you don't have legislators that you like, you may be able to elect local government officials that you like. And people move to areas based on how the government best represents them. And here in Orange and Osceola County, we have, over the last several election cycles, become a very Democratic leaning community. So the elected officials here are Democratic leaning, and that's what people vote for. People who represent their ideology. People did not vote for the governor here in Orange County in either of his elections. So for the governor to impose his will on people who did not vote for the governor is wrong. And that's a dictatorship. And I didn't do anything to put my constituency in danger. That has been shown and debunked over and over and over again. So the reason that I was removed is because the governor disagreed with my ideology. And that is wrong. It's unjust. And I also believe it's illegal.
I wanted to follow up because there is one issue that is one concept that has sent prosecutors across the country, including some of the biggest, or I think the biggest and oldest organizations of prosecuting attorneys, speaking out against what happened with your suspension. And that is the concept of prosecutorial discretion, and the role it plays in the American criminal justice system. And speaking in general, I was hoping that you could give our readers a brief explanation of why prosecutorial discretion is important, and if this is a nation of laws, why shouldn't prosecutors go after any violation with the same vigor and seek the same outcomes? So, because I think that's a concept that has played a big role in this race.
Yeah, absolutely. So the American Bar Association criminal legal system, the criminal legal section came out and denounced my suspension for that exact reason. Prosecutorial discretion is a long protected, discretion that means that prosecutors are not supposed to be politicized, right? Prosecutors have they are admonished and they are advised by the American Bar Association tenets for a prosecutor to do justice, not merely to convict. And sometimes doing justice doesn't mean obtaining a conviction, even if someone is guilty. Sometimes it means obtaining that conviction and going for the harshest sentence that the law provides for. But if prosecutors don't have discretion to determine when and how situations should be handled, then we're just political machines. And unfortunately, that's what the prosecutor's office here in Orange County is now. I had an attorney talk to me about a case where someone was arrested for a possession of a trafficking in fentanyl. And after reviewing the evidence, it became clear that the law enforcement officer in that case was not truthful. And that attorney presented that information to the state attorney's office saying, here is the evidence. We took a deposition. Here's the transcript of the deposition. I'm going to file a motion to suppress. Will you concede to the fact that the evidence shows that this officer was not truthful? And the state attorney's office here declined to do that. And I am going to say that the reason they declined to do that is because they are a politicized state attorney's office, and they understand that they answer to the governor. And the governor wants all cases prosecuted, regardless of the facts, regardless of the evidence. So this attorney was required to go forward and present this motion to suppress to the court, which was ultimately granted. And in the order, the judge said that he had serious concerns regarding the credibility of the officer who testified in this case. And even the officer testified that he was not truthful when he made the statements that resulted in the individual's arrest. And not only was the case ultimately dismissed because of the motion to suppress, but because this state attorney's office is filing pretrial detention motions as often as they possibly can, this individual sat in jail for 6 months until this case was ultimately dismissed. That is not justice. That is politics. And a state attorney's office should not be run by politics. They should be run on justice.
Thank you. There is so much more we could talk about. I wish that I'm going to sneak in one more question on policy issues, and that is the concept of charging juvenile offenders as adults. You said that you think when you ran for office last time, you said that you think that this is something should only be done when it is absolutely necessary. Have you changed your view on that, or is what should people expect to see in that area if they reelect you?
So it's important to understand I haven't changed my view on anything. This suspension is invalid. And for me to look back and say, in retrospect, I could have or should have done something differently. Yes, every day there are things that we can all improve on and do better and do differently. But my stance and my view on policy is not one of those things. I was not suspended because I did anything wrong. I was suspended because the governor wanted to go on the Republican debate stage 2 weeks later and brag about the fact that he suspended 2 Democrats who were state attorneys. I am clear on the fact that we had juveniles who were committing some pretty serious crime, and we still have that. And my response to that was that we need to have a more effective juvenile justice system. And what I did to accomplish that was draft legislation that our representative, LaVon Bracey Davis, took to Tallahassee and presented and could not get passed simply because my name was affiliated with it. But that legislation would have allowed the court and the state attorney's office to have more discretion over juveniles in the juvenile justice system, as opposed to relinquishing that authority to the Department of Juvenile Justice, so that when a juvenile committed a very serious offense, rather than cutting them loose in 18 months, as is the practice of the Department of Juvenile Justice, we could hold on to them up until their 25th birthday, if necessary. And I encourage you to go back and look at the legislation, because this would have provided a fix for what we were seeing, which was an increase in juvenile crime. So what I said still stands. I do not believe that the answer to juvenile crime is treating children as adults. That is a legal fiction. Children are children, adults are adults. When we take children and shove them into the adult system, we haven't made our community safer. We saw that with the Amazon delivery driver robbery that took place in what I believe was January of 2023. That child was charged under a different administration as an adult. He went to prison for 7 years. He came home in November of 2022 and committed the Amazon delivery driver robbery in January of 2024. Charging children as adults doesn't make us safer. Fixing our inadequate juvenile justice system will.
Thank you so much. And the last question I wanted to ask you is somewhat speculative, but I think that there's been enough crosstalk by all parties that it is a foreseeable outcome. Some people have predicted that should you win re-election, and this is a heavily Democratic circuit, that the governor will simply suspend you again. Are you prepared for that eventuality? What would you do in response to that, should it happen?
Should it happen, I think it'll be further evidence that everything that I've said here today is factual, because there wasn't a reason to suspend me the first time. And if the governor should suspend me again immediately after winning, it will show a few things. One, he does not care about the will of the voters of Orange and Osceola counties. I already know that to be true. 497,000 people voted for the platform that I ran on, and he took their voices away. He took their votes away. I am running because this is a democracy. Unless and until that changes, in a democracy, the voters choose who they want their elected officials to be. So I have gone out and said, I am going to stand up for democracy. This election isn't about me. This isn't about my opponent. This election is every bit about democracy. And I am the only candidate in this race who respects the voters' rights to choose their elected official. And because I respect the voters' rights to choose who will serve them, the voters can trust me to respect their rights as it relates to the criminal legal system, their right to remain silent, their right to remain free from unreasonable search and seizure, their right to an attorney. And if an individual, a state attorney, doesn't respect those rights, then we can't have a fair and equitable justice system. So I admonish the voters to consider that and not to vote out of fear. Don't be afraid. We have to stand up. The time for us to stand up for our democracy is now.
Thank you so much. We promised that we would get you done quickly because we've all got storm prep to do. We're recording this with Milton on his way very quickly. But I did want to remind our readers, the Orlando Sentinel will be making an endorsement in this race. As always, we urge you to take that as just one piece of the puzzle as you look at these two candidates and ask yourself who would best represent your values and your aspirations for public safety in the Ninth Circuit. There are lots of other sources, starting with the Sentinel's archives, which are just brimming over with stories about every development in this race, starting with your election, Ms. Worrell. And there are also some recorded debates between the two of you, and there are myriad other opportunities to get information on this race. And so just take a look for yourself, dear readers, and decide who you think would do about the best job in this very important job. So with that, Ms. Worrell, if you can just give us a 2-minute pitch on why voters should elect you to return to office.
Thank you. I started my career in this community almost 25 years ago as a public defender. And after that, I went out into private practice before becoming a professor at the University of Florida College of Law, where for 17 years, I trained lawyers how to practice both criminal defense and prosecution. Many of them went on to be prosecutors and defense attorneys right here in this community. After that, I became the founding director of the Conviction Integrity Unit here at the State Attorney's Office, where we focused on the fact that in this country, over 3,000 people have been exonerated after being wrongfully convicted for crime they didn't commit, 30 of them off death row right here in the state of Florida. I then went on to become a chief legal officer of a nonprofit organization, all before being elected by 497,000 members of this community to serve you as your state attorney. Now, I'm not a politician, and people will say, well, you are now because you're in politics. But hear me when I say, I didn't take this job because I wanted to use it as a stepping stone to something else. I took this job because after working in the system for, at that time, 20 years, I understood that I could sit around and continue to complain about all the things that were wrong with the system, or I could step out of my comfort zone and do something about it. And during my 2.5 years in office, I led with integrity. I worked with my community partners. I worked with law enforcement. I worked with the mayor's offices and other community organizations to implement programs that would reduce crime and mass incarceration, because that's what I promised this community. I also implemented mechanisms for governmental accountability and accountability of law enforcement so that the men and women who actually go out every day and protect and serve us as they have vowed to do receive the respect from the community that they deserve. And when I'm reelected, I vow to continue the work that I started, the work that you, the community, elected me to do. And because you know that I respect your right to choose your own elected officials, you can trust me to respect all of the rights that I've discussed herein today and to answer independently only to you, because I'm the only candidate in this race with the experience, with the integrity, and the independence to bring justice in this community. Thank you.
Thank you so much.